Dan Meyer joins us now, national security lawyer and a former intelligence officer. He's also managing partner at the law firm Tully Rinke. All right, Dan, how do former President Trump's public comments about this Mar-a-Lago search compare to what we're hearing from the attorneys, either in the arguments or in their court papers?
Well, the president's been dismissive of the actual need for the proceeding, and he's making a case, I think, against himself. The bottom line is these were classified documents, and there's no reason why classified documents should be in an unsecure place. In the normal course of things, as in the case of the Nixon administration, they provided a separate SCIF for President Nixon when he wanted to write his memoirs. All of that was well known within the White House in the last administration. There are archivists in the White House advising the political staff every day on the packaging up and shipping of documents. So the president's trying to make this something other than what it is, which is a case of unlawful removal of classified documents. It's more like John Deutsch's situation when he was director of CIA. Sandy Berger was deputy national security advisor, was doing some work for one of the commissions and took classified documents out of the archives. That's what the focus actually is in truth, but the president's trying to politicize it, and that's for a different agenda.
Well, the former president has a history of dragging out legal cases, of creating delays and counterfilings. Can you do that against the Department of Justice?
Well, I think he's actually might have a tactical victory in that sense if he gets a special master, because that would be dragging this out, at least for the short term. I really don't think the Justice Department is all that keen to move fast on any proceeding that it's moving in, especially under this Attorney General. So I don't really know that dragging it out really plays against what they want to do. And in the end of the game, if you remember some of these other cases, the people who were eventually charged were charged with a misdemeanor. And so I don't know, even if they found Donald Trump to have committed a misdemeanor, I don't know how much that would have impacted him politically. So the delay, the slow roll, may actually benefit both sides.
So in a post on social media Wednesday, Mr. Trump seemed to acknowledge there were sensitive documents in that picture the Department of Justice released, though he previously had said the items may have been planted by agents. Does this get simple for the Department of Justice that he's saying something that seems incriminating?
Well, that speaks to something that has not been discussed generally, which is there's got to be at least one or two strata of people below the former president who handled these documents. And the question is whether they knew they were classified. Kind of hard to not know they were classified given those cover sheets, and whether they had some intent. And the intent, of course, is what everybody's trying to figure out. And I think that list, that index, could give some idea of what the intent was in removing the documents if they are grouped into certain categories. But there are people below the president that may be liable, and he may be able to push off his own personal liability with the type of idea of a plant or something of that nature. But the plant would have to be from his own staff. These were handled by his own people, and I don't understand the rationale behind his own loyal acolytes planting classified documents on it.
Dan, as a former intelligence agent, what do you make of the documents, the types of documents revealed so far, and the fact that agents needed additional security clearances just to gather what was at Mar-a-Lago?
Well, I have to be careful not to speak on anything during my time on the DNI staff, which was between 2012 and 2018. But in general, the concern on the intelligence community side is going to be with the protection of their sources. And then on the diplomatic side, on the State Department side, particularly with Macron, there's going to be concerns about what's in those documents that may leak out and embarrass us with respect to our allies. The French are still technically an ally. So there's a lot of equities at play in this, and each agency that has information in those whatever 30 boxes I think I've heard some totals of is probably right now going through their operations and trying to find out who needs to be protected, what systems need to be protected, because with the intelligence game, it's not so much the intelligence you collect on your foreign adversaries that is really important, because often that's very dated very quickly. It's the means by which you collect it that you need to protect, and that's what this is placed in danger. And my big fear is that these documents were out of the control of the federal government for a very long time. Somebody very well could have Xeroxed 30 boxes of documents in that time period, and there could be a whole shadow set of boxes somewhere that they didn't get control of soon enough. And we could have 10 or 15 years of these things dribbling out in various ways.
Well, there is polling, Dan. 59% of Americans say the former president acted inappropriately handling the classified documents after leaving the White House. It's a recent Quinnipiac poll showing that. So the law is supposed to be independent of public opinion, in theory. From your experience, your long service, is that true? Is that how it works? The law remains independent of public opinion?
Well, I think the law, I think public opinion does affect it at certain times. And look at past cases. There was a pardon for Scooter Libby, the vice president's chief of staff. He had leaked a identity of one of our covered individuals, and he was pardoned actually by Donald Trump. They were only misdemeanors for the former director of the CIA and for the former deputy national security advisor. I think some of that was elite opinion, people wanting to give people, members of the inside the Beltway crowd, a break. But I do think public opinion, and this is really kind of a sad commentary, public opinion could sway this so that there's a soft pedal by the Justice Department. And then you have to wonder, well, what do you tell Reality Winner or John Kiriakou or Ed Snowden, who all had similar problems with handling classified information, and some of them actually did prison time.
Dan Meyer, thanks for joining us and sharing your expertise. We thank you.
Have a good evening.